And so one thing I also want to cover while we wait here is don't get too wrapped up on trying to be a master of all trades. You know your limitations and you know what you really need to work on. And so these skills in this webinar are a little bit at the intermediate level. So please know your limitations, but at the same time, most people use NVivo to import their transcripts and do some coding, and that's about it. But I'll tell you, you are shortchanging yourself if you don't really explore with some of these other features that we're going to go over today. So one other thing you can import in NVivo is a classification sheet. And where a classification sheet comes in handy, not so much if you have one participant or 5 participants, or I say even 10, but I would use a classification sheet for 10 participants in a study just because I like to be efficient that way. But a classification sheet can really become handy when you have, participants, anything past 10, 15, 20 to 100, you can definitely use a classification sheet to help you out so you don't have to import attributes and things like that. And you use a classification sheet to manually assign your values to your attributes. One thing to note is that cell A1, so if I did a classification sheet in Excel, cell A1 becomes the name of the classification. Anytime you input a classification sheet or a survey, again, pro tip, because it's not going to work for you and you're going to beat your head up against the wall, you got to close it first before you import it. I still do it, especially if I am kind of in a rush for some strange reason. Just close it out before you try to import something. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a case classification, or show you how to import classification sheet, making them cases, but it's the same process for a file classification. In the classification sheet that I am going to use today is pretty much the start of a lit review. And so that's pretty much how I use classification sheets, is I use them in NVivo to import my lit review matrix. So it may look familiar to you once we get to that point, but a lit review matrix is in essence a classification sheet. So let me switch screens here. So do we have any questions while we are waiting for what I've covered so far, Dr. Rawls? Okay.
We don't currently have questions, but I'd like to encourage you all to ask, and I will relay them to Dr. Adams.
Okay. And can you see my screen yet? Alrighty, awesome. So we did surveys, and now remember we're on classification sheets. So because I told you I am importing a lit review matrix to help me with analysis and synthesis, we're going to click on the literature folder. So inside of cases, because remember I told you the power of cases in webinar 1, that's how you really harness the power of NVivo, is in cases. So I created a folder called literature for my cases because I know I'm going to import a lit review matrix. So I go to literature, import, and if you scroll to the ribbon here under classifications, you will see classification sheet. So a window will open up eventually for you, but it did for me. And you just browse to your classification sheet on your desktop or wherever you have it. For me, when I import classification sheets or surveys, I like to have it already on my desktop because I forget where I have things sometimes. Um, I do try to stay organized and have things in folders, but if you do a large study or things like that, you may kind of forget where you put some things, especially if you're doing things throughout the day. So here you should see um, in this menu that I have a classification sheet example / lit review. So I can make sure I select the right one instead of my survey. I will double click on it and hit next. Now, one thing to note, so don't freak out when you try to do some things that you don't necessarily know how to do inside of NVivo. If you would notice at the top of this dialog box, it'll say import classification sheet wizard. There's a query wizard in NVivo. There's pretty much a wizard for anything. So NVivo tends to try to help you out and make sure you don't mess anything up. Um, but at the same time, you still kind of halfway know what you're doing, but at least you don't have to start from scratch. And so one thing that I'm going to change here in step 2 is I don't want my literature to be file classifications because you can't really run those powerful queries inside of NVivo with file classifications. Again, your doorway to that power is your cases. So I'm going to make and I only have two articles per se here. I'm just going to make it a case classification. You will leave the defaults the same for our purposes, and then we're going to hit next. When you get to step 3 in the import wizard, NVivo is going to ask you to specify how cases are represented in this file. And the default is hierarchical names, but I just want to select as names because I know when I view this, I want to be able to see the author names. And you can even change the location inside of cases. So remember, we created that folder inside of cases just for our literature. So I'm just going to select literature, the literature folder under cases, because that's where I want it, and then hit OK, and then hit next. So step 4 of the wizard, as you will see, we're just going to leave that alone. We're going to leave it by default, but that's where you can kind of assign attribute values for unassigned or NA, because those are technically attribute values, unassigned and NA. And we're going to leave the date order the same. Okay, so you should be able to see here what I am referring to with unassigned, NA, and the date. Just leave that the same. And then we're going to just hit finish. And again, I apologize for the lag. I hit finish, but it'll take a couple of seconds for you to be able to see. But while you wait, what you will see here is NVivo has taken that classification sheet and created cases of your articles. So these are just some made up articles that I just made up for the sake of time. But you will see there are 2 cases because there were only technically 2 articles that I reviewed. And both one authored by Adams JL, one authored by Adams JT. But if you look to the right-hand side and scroll, you will see some common themes or some common things, not themes, that you typically put in a lit review: the publication date, the title of the article, or if it was a book, the title of the book, the journal name, database search, things of that nature. And what you can do at this point is you can definitely run some queries, run some charts. So say, for example, you wanted to know, well, what year was the highest publication rate for my specific topic, you can easily run a chart with your cases. Let's say you wanted to explore, well, 2020 was the highest year of publication for my research topic, but what journal and by what author combined produced the most, by journal. So what's your go-to journals? You can definitely run a chart or query to figure that out as well. But that's the power of, and I'll go to this more in webinar 3, but that is the power of a classification sheet.